point out that the sun shines down its power to all the world and makes the wind blow strong as it will. I wonder how gentle rains can fall upon the land, so lovely earth can stay lovely still. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. This is Energy Week with George Harvey and Tom Fennell. And Steve Reucroft, Dr. Steve Reucroft, who is joining us. And Dr. Steve Reucroft is one of those fellows at CERN who wrote the paper announcing the fact that the theory, should I say, that the Higgs boson had been discovered. And he's going to tell us about whatever he wants to tell us about.
I promise I will not talk about the Higgs boson.
I promise not to ask you about the Higgs boson.
Excellent, that's what I want to hear. And if there's a huge public demand, I'll come on a future show and talk about the Higgs boson.
Okay,
that'd be great.
That would be great.
That'd be great.
We don't think it's got much to do with energy, but you never know. But can I just make one comment about efficiency? Because I think it's very important. It's one of the things that the human race is very, very good at doing. Taking something and slowly making it more efficient via technology. That's exactly what human beings do very well. And one of the best examples, I think, is the automobile. I mean, I can remember the automobile 50 years ago, 60 years ago, when my father first had one. I mean, talk about a ridiculous object. I mean, they operated and they used a lot of petrol and they moved. But the difference between an automobile then and an automobile today is like the difference between night and day. And that's just one little step here, one little step there, making things more efficient, more clever via technology. And the same thing has happened with computers too. Same thing exactly.
Well, one of the things that you remind me of is seeing pictures. One of them was a picture of Model T Fords coming out of a plant. And the cars, as they came out of the plant, were smoking.
Yeah. And
I remember seeing, you might remember a movie that was called Battle of Britain. It had Laurence Olivier in it.
Yeah.
It had Susanna York in it.
Yeah.
And I remember seeing the cars that the Germans were driving around, and the generals were in them, just belching huge amounts of smoke because they were so badly, what would be the cause? Badly put together. They were not old cars. They were not beat up old cars. They were relatively new cars.
But they were smoking.
But they were smoking.
And they were too young to smoke.
They were too young to smoke. And by modern standards, they shouldn't even be allowed on the road. But nevertheless, we have overcome some of that. And with computers, you know, the first computer I worked with had RAM, core, donuts that had been stitched together by hand. One donut was 1 bit. And when that computer, which I came to used, it was a used computer in 1968, I think when that computer was built, that core was $1 a bit. Now today, and I've said this before, even possibly on the show, you go into Staples, you buy a 32 gigabyte memory card for a camera for $18 or whatever. You're buying what would have cost in those days $255 billion. The price of power, the dollar has gone so low that what used to cost $1 now costs less than $1,000,000th of a cent. And that's why you can go to a place like WordPress and start a blog and get free memory. You know, I've got a dozen blogs, so I've got a dozen times 3 gigabytes, which is what they give out for free. Now, you had a point there.
What was the point?
Well, you were talking about human beings being really good at efficiency.
Yeah.
If they have a reason to do it.
Yeah, if they want to do it, if there's a willingness and leadership, then the human race, our species, is amazingly good at taking something and making it a lot better.
Yes.
And usually that means a lot more efficient. Not always, but usually it does. And,
okay.
And you're right, those flash memories. And by the way, I can't even imagine how those damn things work. They're amazing.
They are, yeah.
It's like, you remember Arthur C. Clarke, the great science fiction author? He said once that once technology gets to a certain advanced state, it's indistinguishable from magic.
Well,
Absolutely.
actually, yeah.
And it's true.
And I
you look at
remember-
this screen of this laptop here. I mean, how the
Absolutely.
hell does that work? I took one apart just to see it. I have no idea. I have no more idea how it works.
Well, you know, one of the things
Could you
that
put it back together again?
No.
one of the things that I've thought about was exactly that. You know, people talk about reverse engineering something.
Yeah.
If you took a laptop like this and gave it to a government agency that was trying to win the Second World War, they might or might not have tried to reverse engineer it. If they really were smart, they would not have tried to reverse engineer it. They would have opened it up, looked at the motherboard and say, we've got no hope to try to figure out what this is. Because the underlying science behind it had not been developed yet. And when you don't have the underlying science, you've got a long ways to go before you can understand what you're looking at.
Yep.
Now, one of the things that we promised everybody we were going to do was talk about nuclear waste.
Talk about energy and nuclear waste.
Energy and nuclear waste.
Yeah.
Now, what have you got to say about energy and nuclear waste? A lot.
Well, yeah. I mean, I have an opinion that's slightly different from many people, including George, I think. And I don't know what, I've never talked to you about it, but I don't think at the moment we're in the luxurious situation where we can just throw away one source of energy and say we don't want it. I think that would be a mistake. We've got several different alternatives for making energy, and the human race is insatiable in its demand for energy. So I think we really have to, we owe it to the human race, we owe it to our future, we owe it to everything to pursue every technique. That's what my personal opinion is. We need to pursue every technique, and that includes nuclear reactors. I think we know how to build nuclear reactors pretty badly. We certainly know how to build them a lot better, but no nuclear reactor for a long time has been built using any other technique than the old military nuclear reactor that was vouchsafed by Admiral Rickover, I guess.
Which means a reactor that's
using enriched uranium, uranium-235, which
could we say just any reactor with critical mass as its underlying?
Probably, yeah. But all the reactors that I know, there may be a couple of counterexamples, but they use uranium-235, and uranium in its natural form that you dig out of the ground is 99.something% uranium-238, 99.3% uranium-238, I think.
I believe that's
And
right.
if you make a reactor that uses uranium-235, you've got to enrich so the percentage of uranium-235 is at least about 3%. So it's a devil of a job to do that. It's a very expensive process, and it's kind of not the best way of doing it. We know how to make nuclear reactors better than that. And as always with this human efficiency, we can make nuclear reactors more efficient and more safe than we used to be able to make. So I don't think we should just turn our back on nuclear power and close the door. I think it's too important that it provides energy in a way that is completely independent of anything else on our planet. I mean, all the other sources that we talk about basically come from the sun, solar energy. Nuclear energy has got nothing to do with solar energy. It's energy that's lying in the ground for free. It's potential energy that's there and that we can use. And I think it would be a mistake to turn off that source.
No.
Having said that, nuclear power stations, the way we build them now, well, we don't build them anymore, the ones we use now, the nuclear reactors now, they have one terrible problem that is almost a unique problem for energy sources. They produce very large, vast, I would say, quantities of terrible toxic materials, radiotoxic, lethal materials, the so-called nuclear waste problem. Nobody really knows how much nuclear waste, and I'm really talking about high-level nuclear waste. I mean, if somebody is in the laboratory with gloves on and they spill some radioactive iodine that they were about to inject into somebody for their thyroid or something, that probably constitutes, the gloves would be contaminated with nuclear waste, but that's called low-level nuclear waste. And we've no idea how much of that. That's probably 10 to the 9 tons of low-level nuclear waste, but it's not really that serious. The really serious stuff is the high level, which is predominantly what they call spent fuel rods from nuclear reactors. I mean, they're not really spent. They just have a percentage of uranium-235 that's a bit lower than they started out, and they're still very useful devices that could be used to make energy, actually. And conservatively, it's estimated, and nobody really knows, that there's at least 300,000 tons of this stuff hanging around in many locations on our planet, probably on the order of 300 locations, which you may notice is very close to the number of working reactors that we have on the planet, about 300. So there's probably about 1,000 tons of horrible stuff. I mean, it's stuff that's dangerous to the human race for certainly hundreds of thousands of years, probably millions of years. I mean, some of the nasty things are not going to be safe for tens of millions of years.
It's sitting in casks like these. I put a picture up on the screen.
Yeah,
These casks made of concrete.
and we've been producing this stuff now for 50 years, and the human race has not bothered to find a solution. I think if we wanted to find a solution, we could find a solution. I mean, fitting in with what I was saying earlier, these small steps, but it's not turned out to be economically interesting for anybody to find a solution, so we just leave this stuff piling up on nuclear reactor sites, and it's dangerous stuff.
Let somebody else worry about it.
Let somebody else worry about it, yeah.
Now,
let your kids worry about it,
Yeah,
or
right.
let their kids worry about it.
If I could break in here, Steve, there's something that you told me quite a while ago that I bear in mind, and that is this is nuclear material. We can't burn it in oxygen, and oxygen, you know, we can't destroy it by zapping it with electricity. There are a bunch of things that we can do with, we can't compost it. There are a bunch of things that we can do with different kinds of waste, but none of them applies to this. The only way of reducing this stuff so that it's actually safe is to cause it to undergo a nuclear change. And that means that we need a reactor that will react this stuff.
Well, that's one possibility. There are several solutions that have been considered, and I usually put them into two categories: passive solutions versus active solutions. And passive solutions, you dig a big deep hole in the ground, or you take advantage of a hole that's already there, and then you just dump the stuff in the hole and hope that it's going to be stable for 10 million years and won't appear somewhere else on this planet of ours. And as we said earlier, we're all living on the surface of a sphere. And if you dump something in a hole 5 miles deep in one part of the sphere, God only knows where it's going to end up, but it could end up somewhere else on the sphere. This is it's not a living sphere, but it's almost like a living sphere, our Earth. It's not static. Things are moving all the time. The whole planet is moving and shifting. And so, I mean, but that's a passive solution, and it's really the only solution that I've ever heard politicians talk about seriously, actually. The idea of taking advantage of a hole somewhere and just dumping all the stuff in. Years ago, I remember guys talking about, I think they were tongue-in-cheek, but you never can tell with people like that. They were talking about putting the stuff on rocket ships and having NASA dump it in the sun.
Yeah, I've heard about that.
And
shoot it off to the sun.
Again, it's a passive solution in the sense that you don't get rid of, well, you get rid of it as far as we're concerned, but can you imagine the risk inherent in such a solution? I mean, what percentage of rocket ships don't make it out of the atmosphere?
And if the rocket ship blows up, it comes right back to Earth.
It comes right back, and it's not just in one location now, it's spread out everywhere. And this is nasty stuff, very nasty stuff. And then or you could do what probably various military entities have done, and that is just dump it in the ocean. You know, military submarines with a spent nuclear reactor. I mean, it must be very tempting just to pull a lever and the whole thing just goes and drops to the bottom.
Actually, I've read that they lost 200 kilograms of plutonium at Sellafield into the Irish Sea.
No, you're going to have to speak up.
I'm sorry, Steve. I have read that they lost 200 kilograms of plutonium into the Irish Sea from Sellafield.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah.
Why am I not looking surprised? I may have been looking puzzled, but I'm not.
There are certainly dairy farms in the area of Sellafield that. And
by the way, when I said 300,000 tons of this nasty stuff, that's just the stuff, the commercial stuff we know about. I mean, I have absolutely no idea. I don't think anybody does. Maybe nobody on the planet knows how much military stuff there is.
And some of that is in reactors that are sitting on the bottom of the ocean.
Probably, yeah. Although, again, I mean, I don't know if that's true. It's just people...
We know that it's true because we've lost submarines.
Yeah. Some of them, some nuclear subs have been lost, and then you know it's true.
Yeah.
But that's a bit different, because then the whole thing is contained. I mean, the sub is a marvellous containment object.
It's a marvelous containment object that is contained in something that may or may not be able to survive for the amount of time it's got to survive.
Yeah, that's another problem, of course. I mean, we're talking unimaginably long timescales.
Yes.
You know, I mean, physicists like me, I'm a particle physicist, we're used to, and I taught astronomy and astrophysics for years when I was at a university, but we're used to talking about billions of years, you know, without even, just very casually and carelessly. But in truth, human beings can't really conceive of timescales longer than about 100 years, and even that's stretching it. In fact, it's often said that people can't conceive of numbers bigger than 7, I think it is, or maybe 5, and timescales longer than about 10 minutes. But some of us may be a bit better than that. But anyway, then, you know, then as George was saying a few minutes ago, there's another category of solutions to get rid of nuclear waste, which says, well, nuclear waste was really created by us using nuclear processes. We were bombarding objects which were not really particularly dangerous, bombarding them with neutrons to make them dangerous in order to produce energy via a process called nuclear fission, which is the process when a nucleus that has become unstable because you've dumped a neutron in it and made it into an unstable nucleus. It just spontaneously goes poof and blows up into 2 almost equally sized smaller nuclei and spits out a couple of neutrons as well. And those neutrons go on to continue the process. That's what we mean by a chain reaction, that neutron in makes a couple more neutrons that then make 2 more, and you get a lot of neutrons, making the whole process happen in a nuclear reactor. Well, that process is the process that makes these dangerous things. And so, as George was saying, that it's very tempting to think of using such a process to get rid of nuclear waste. And indeed, there are processes that can do that. And there are many examples now of nuclear reactors that can use nuclear waste as a fuel, actually. I was showing George, there was an article in the Boston Globe a couple of weeks ago, I don't know if you can see that, on May the 11th, about 2 startups in Cambridge, Massachusetts, near Boston, run by 2 MIT guys, and they're getting money and they're developing nuclear reactors that are completely different to the current generation of nuclear reactors. And one of them at least advertises that it will be able to use current nuclear waste as a fuel. Now that's a very attractive possibility, in my opinion, very attractive. But of course, you know, they're just starting to work, and we know it's how many years? 20 years, really, realistically, before you could possibly have a device working. And then you're going to have all these technological tweaks to make it efficient. So it's a long time. It's a long-term program.
So we're going to have to start doing that right now.
We're going to have to start doing something right now, yeah. And another problem that worries me a lot is you've got this problem very close to home here in Brattleboro. You've got a reactor just down the road in Vernon that's going to close down next year, I guess, or the year after. I mean,
this year.
Is it this year even?
Yes.
Yeah, they're going to finally close down. People think it's because of all the pressure, but I suspect it's just simple economics.
You're absolutely right.
They have said it's economics, and when you look at the economics, it's very believable.
Yeah, there you go. But anyway, they've got about 1,000 tons, we think. I mean, nobody really knows, and they're not talking about it, but there should be anyway about 1,000 tons of very nasty stuff in Vernon.
That is it.
Is that it? That it is.
Well,
on the right.
The picture on the right, the picture on the left is not.
No, that's San Onofre.
Yeah. Okay, those are the casks with...
Those are the casks at Vernon.
And they've still got a bunch of them in the pool. They still have a bunch of them in the pool.
In the pool itself, yeah.
It's going to take something on the order of 7 to 10 years. I forget what the actual number is to empty the pool.
At the moment, the Entergy is still operating Vermont Yankee, like it or not, and therefore they are looking after this waste in some way. They're looking after it. They're making sure that it doesn't fall into the Connecticut River or worse, although I don't know what worse would be. But what happens when they've closed down and they've moved on? Somebody's going to have the responsibility of doing something about that nuclear waste. And it seems to me when you say, Tom, that we should start doing something now, you're dead right. You're dead right. It's a problem that is now very, very urgent and has to be solved really soon. And another thing George was intimating at a few minutes is there's another type of nuclear reactor that uses a fuel completely different from the uranium fuel of normal reactors. He uses a material which is much more abundant in the Earth's crust, so there's a lot more of it readily available, called thorium. And the thing about uranium that is bad is that natural uranium contains a very, very small percentage of the good stuff, uranium-235, the useful stuff. Thorium, on the other hand, it's 100% good stuff. That's the good news about thorium. The bad news about thorium is it doesn't have the advantage of uranium-235. It is not fissile. It does not fiss. I don't know if you can use that word, fiss. But
yeah, I've used it. I like the word.
Yeah, when this process where a big nucleus splits up, thorium doesn't do that naturally. What you have to do is dump a neutron into thorium, and then the thorium becomes something else, uranium actually, a different isotope, uranium-233, I think.
Yeah, 233.
That then undergoes fission. So a thorium reactor has to be just a little bit more complicated than a uranium reactor in that you have to provide neutrons from outside continuously. In a uranium reactor, you have to provide neutrons to get it going, but once it gets going, the chain reaction maintains it and it keeps going forever until you do something to stop it. Whereas a thorium reactor doesn't have that advantage, disadvantage, I don't know. I like the idea of having a reactor that doesn't have a chain reaction. I mean, a reactor that you can stop at any time if you decide to stop it. In the case of thorium reactor, you just turn a switch.
Turn the switch.
Yeah, the neutrons
stop. Yeah.
And the reaction stops, and it's no longer a nuclear reactor.
I want to point out here that one of the biggest problems you can get at a nuclear reactor is loss of offsite power. And what this means is that the thorium-based reactor that requires neutrons from some other source, if you have a loss of offsite power, it will shut down.
Yeah.
It will not continue running.
Yeah.
So that source of a meltdown cannot happen.
Yeah. That's right. So there are definitely some advantages in the technique, and the technique was developed many, many years ago. There was only one working thorium reactor, to my knowledge anyway, has been built. And I'm not sure I'm right anymore, because people have been working on it in various random countries on our sphere. But at Oak Ridge Lab, there was a thorium reactor back in the early days of nuclear power. Alvin Weinberg, who was the director at the time, he was very much behind a thorium reactor, and they built a working thorium reactor. But then the obsession with uranium-235 modern-day reactors, and Admiral Rickover, who decided that was the only way you could make a reactor suitable for deep underwater submarines. You couldn't really have a thorium reactor in a sub because you need a source of neutrons, and where would you get the source of neutrons from? So,
and they didn't have a source that was available in those days.
Yeah, they did. You could make,
not small enough to put in a submarine.
Well, not small enough, that's right. You'd have to have a very long submarine with a particle accelerator going the length of the submarine. And they decided, Admiral decided that's not a good thing to do.
Yeah.
So they went the uranium route, and ever since then thorium has just languished, even though it has a lot of very clear advantages. Now, a few years ago, the idea was really revitalized by a guy called Carlo Rubbia, who is actually a colleague of mine at CERN. I've never worked with him, but I used to know him. I haven't talked to him in decades, but he got a patent and everything for a device he calls the energy amplifier, which is a thorium reactor. And it's called the energy amplifier because the energy you need to drive the neutrons in to get the thing going is less than the energy that comes out. So it's a nuclear reactor. But it has one enormous advantage. And this is what Carlo liked about it, that the coolant that you use, you always have to have a coolant. Instead of using water like reactors that people use nowadays, you use liquid lead as the coolant. And that has the advantage that you can dissolve a lot of stuff in the liquid lead, including nuclear waste. And the nuclear waste dissolved in the liquid lead, it then takes away the heat from the reactor core. But more than that, because of all the copious neutrons that are buzzing all around in the reactor core, the nuclear waste is converted, transformed into non-dangerous. It's still nuclear waste, but it's not as dangerous. It doesn't have a lifetime, a half-life, we call it, of 10 to the 7 years. It has a half-life of maybe 10 to the maybe 10 to the 2 years, maybe 70 years, something like that. And you get extra energy coming out. So you get energy from the nuclear waste, and the nuclear waste is converted into less dangerous nuclear waste, all inside a device that's a nuclear reactor. And no one's built one. Carlo patented it, and I think he got rid of the patent because, well, it ran out, but I think he sold it. And there are companies, there are different entities around the planet that are talking about building such devices, but I don't know of any that's been built yet. Last summer there was a conference at CERN, the place that was on the screen a short while ago. There was a conference on thorium, the state of thorium. I have a bunch of the talks here in a folder, and it's very interesting because one of the talks was the status of thorium reactors in India. Another one was the status of thorium reactors in Japan. Another one was the status of thorium reactors in the UK, in France, in everywhere you can think of except the US, because there is no status of thorium reactors in the US. And it's a shame because it does offer some advantages over the traditional uranium-235 reactors. But again, it would be, I think, minimum of 20 years before, even if we started tomorrow, it would take 20 years before we could have a working device.
All right. Now, if I could recap a couple of things here. A reactor of this type would not be creating waste. It would be eliminating waste.
Right.
And the waste that it did create, in other words, the waste that you wind up with, I should say, the waste that the waste you start with is converted into is nowhere near as dangerous and has half-lives that would be very short. The figure that I have read is that if you ran one of these things efficiently, you would wind up with waste that would be approximately as radioactive as coal ash after 300 years. Mm-hmm. Now, you're starting with nuclear waste that we worry about,
yep,
and you're turning it into nuclear waste that we could very safely, conveniently bury in a hole in the ground.
Yeah.
The second thing that I want to point out is because the reactor will shut down automatically in the case of a loss of power event, it cannot melt down.
No.
The third thing is you cannot make a bomb out of anything that's going on in this thing except for the waste that you're putting into it.
That's right. That's correct.
So you're making things safer using these things,
yep,
not more dangerous.
Right.
And there's one other thing that I want to point out here. Nuclear power, as it is currently done in nuclear power plants, such as the one at Vermont Yankee, is extremely inefficient. In terms of converting atoms into electricity, you're getting only about 1% of your atoms turned into electricity.
Yeah.
If you use up the other, because about 2% of the atoms are going to be turned into heat that's used to heat the Connecticut River or the atmosphere or something. If you were to use the rest of the 97%, you would be using all of that because you're converting all of it.
Yeah.
And that means that the amount of nuclear waste that we have at Vermont Yankee would be enough to power Vermont for about perhaps 400, 500 years.
I think more than that, but it's certainly a long time.
Well, I'm assuming inefficiencies.
Yeah, and you have to, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, George is right, and I mean, I like to see progress taken in small steps, actually. It makes me more comfortable if you've got something that works and then you just keep on making it better and better and better and better, as we were talking about in the previous hour.
Right.
But this really does look like if it works, I mean, it's always the problem, if it works, that it would be a huge step, a huge step. It does several, I mean, I'm not going to say again what George just said, but he's dead right. I mean, having said all this, I'm not a salesman for the energy amplifier or thorium reactors. I mean, the device was invented, it's on the order of 30 years ago, maybe a little more than 30 years ago now. Which camera am I supposed to look at, by the way? That one, okay. All right, thank you. And
you're doing good.
Yeah. And as George pointed out earlier, in those days, computers were kind of not really very powerful, and
mostly made out of pieces of wood, and they were slipped
tubes. Yeah. I mean, it wasn't quite an abacus that was used, but
they used slide rules to design.
Yeah, we used slide rules in those days too. But all the code that was written to do the simulation studies, because I should back off one step, because whenever you're going to build a complex object, like a nuclear reactor or a particle accelerator or any complicated piece of machinery, you really have to embark on simulation studies, which means you basically build the device in the computer as a model before you build the real device. And then you do everything you can to it. You push it and squeeze it and irradiate it and zap it inside the computer model before you build anything. And that's called computer simulation. And that's what they did with the energy amplifier. They did a full simulation. But because the computers that were used to do the full simulation 30 years ago were not as powerful as the objects that we have today. And also they were using a programming code that I'm very fond of, but it's probably not the most efficient, called Fortran. Everything was written in Fortran. The guys who did the work, they say that there were things, they had to take shortcuts. And so it would be good to redo the simulation, really would, with a modern computer and modern code, with some modern computer scientists. And not too many years ago, a couple of years ago, I put together a team of nuclear engineers at university, actually Kansas State University in Kansas, in Manhattan, Kansas. And they were all gung-ho to work on this problem, and I wrote a proposal to DOE to get money, and we got turned down. We were going to do a full simulation from scratch, using all the modern code, and use a computer that would allow us to really simulate it fully and exhaustively.
Put in the what-ifs.
And we were turned down for funding.
You could put in a what-ifs.
What was...
Cover all the what-ifs, yeah. I mean, one of the things that they were never able to do with the original simulation was they weren't able to simulate the increase in temperature in the core of the thorium. As the reaction gets going, the core gets hotter and hotter and very, very hot indeed in the end. And that changes the rate at which neutrons interact with things in the core.
Now, when you're talking about very, very hot, you're not talking about the kinds of things that we talk about in terms of the sun or astronomy. You're talking about liquid lead here still, right?
Yeah, tens of thousands of degrees, not millions of degrees. The center of our sun is about 10 million degrees.
Yeah.
We're not talking that hot, but it's still hot enough to affect the operation of the process whereby the neutrons are absorbed in the core. And they weren't able to do that because it's very complicated and it involves a lot more computer power than they had. They did the best they could. They simulated it at different temperatures, assuming how the thing would work. And I think they did it right, personally. I've looked at their code and I think it's right. But until it's done properly, you'd never really know. And I would just like to see the whole process repeated.
How much money was the request for that you sent to the DOE?
I think we were asking for just a little bit less than $1 million over 3 years.
Okay.
And we were going to do it all in a university.
Yeah.
And it may have been 5 years we asked for. No, I think it was 3 years.
It seems to me that we had an argument here in Brattleboro very recently at the town meeting over amount of money that was similar to that. Mm-hmm. Our town budget was refused, and the reason was because of an amount of money that was not very far from the amount that you're talking about.
In the grand scheme of things, $1 million isn't even measurable.
It's too small to be measurable.
Too small.
Anybody who wants to lose $1 million, which is too small to be measurable.
Well, if there's anybody out there who has any ideas how we could get enough money to do a simulation, we could do it pretty quickly. I mean, if we threw $2 million bucks at it, we could do it in a year or less, easily. And there's a lot of very clever code exists now that I don't have access to because I'm not a nuclear engineer. You have to have a license, a nuclear engineering license. And my colleagues at Kansas State, they do have the license, and they can get this. This is all code that was developed at Los Alamos lab that can simulate a nuclear reactor, and you just feed in all the conditions you want, and it's been tested and tested and tested, so we can do it. There's just no willingness to do it, and that gets us really back to where we were before. If there's a willingness to solve these problems, there are always people that can solve them, and we could solve it.
And the problem here is, how do you get rid of nuclear waste?
The problem is, how do you get rid of nuclear waste?
Without just dumping it into a hole in the ground.
In fact, I'd like to see a more general investigation of the problem of nuclear waste embarked upon. I'd like to see a panel of experts put together. And again, I did the first steps in this 2 years ago. Put together a group of people whose charge is evaluate every conceivable option that has ever been suggested, evaluate everyone, and write an in-depth, detailed report critiquing every single suggestion, and come up with a recommendation that every government on the planet can have a copy of this, and that they all can read and say, yeah, that makes sense, let's do it. Because once you've got people behind something that makes sense, it really doesn't take long. You know, we talk about 20 years or 8 years before you have a working modular reactor. If you really wanted to do it more quickly, you can do it more quickly. The first nuclear reactors were developed more quickly than that. You can do it. You can do things really, really quickly. The human race, again, has this amazing facility of getting clever things done quickly, if they want to. If there's a willingness, if there's political support and financial support. Look at Los Alamos, the original reason for Los Alamos, how quickly they made a nuclear bomb, a nuclear weapon that had never been built before. Nobody even knew if it would work.
The war was already underway when they conceived of the idea of doing that, and the war was not yet ended when they actually took their bomb into the field. And as a matter of fact, you know, if you think about how quickly things can be developed, the GBU-28, which was used to bomb those deep underground bunkers during the Iraq War, the amount of time that it took between the time that that was first conceived till it was actually used was less than 3 weeks.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that amazing?
It is amazing, yeah, and it's typical actually. I've seen things like that. Look how quickly we were able to put people on the moon. I mean, once the decision was made, go. And that was, everything had to be invented from scratch. And this country did it.
We went from Vanguard rockets to people on the moon.
It's very, very impressive what can be done once there's a willingness to do it. And there has to be a willingness. This nuclear waste is not going away. And it's, I don't know, somehow we've got to get powerful people interested in this problem, and quickly.
And the problem that we're interested in here is how to get rid of nuclear waste without just abandoning it in a hole in the ground.
Right.
And the side benefit of being able to do that, if we can find a way of doing it properly, and there is some promise that we may actually be able to do that properly, is that we would have a source of electrical power that is generated from the process of getting rid of nuclear waste.
Yeah, it sort of reminds me of this thing you showed from Canada of using waste to produce energy. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
If you can use waste to produce energy, you're always doing something that makes you feel good, and you know, you give yourself a stripe and say, "Oh, that makes me feel good." Everybody feels good if you can do that. On the other hand, I suspect the nuclear waste problem, like everything, I think, is not going to have one solution. I think there's going to be like 6 or 7 different solutions that will all have to be adopted. And maybe some of it really will be buried somewhere. I mean, there are some salt mines that I've been reading about that they claim are geologically stable for certainly 20,000 years, but that's really nothing in the big picture.
Like Bayou Corn in Louisiana.
Yeah, that's a perfect example.
Unfortunately, salt mines occasionally collapse, even though they're stable. And in this particular case, we had a sinkhole that was several acres, and there was natural gas or something down there that got very nicely distributed through the aquifer, so people have gas coming out of their wells.
But I suspect that the solution is going to have many prongs, and but nobody's really doing much. Well, I shouldn't say nobody. People are working. I mean, I read an article recently of some company, I think in the UK. Yeah, Sheffield University of all places, they find a way of cutting the volume of nuclear waste by some clever encapsulation technique. And you know that it's clever because you take nuclear waste and instead of having these big things, you just encapsulate it in easier to handle, you know, mouth-sized bites sort of thing.
But you still have nuclear waste.
But you've still got nuclear waste.
I mean, you're describing a process that eliminates the nuclear waste.
Yeah, well,
and oh, by the way, you make money doing it.
That's right.
Yeah,
that sounds like the best solution.
There's another thing that we should point out here, and that is that what Steve has asked for is, in fact, that the government of the United States, the universities of the United States, that the companies in the not just the United States, worldwide, look into a question of what are the options and do a critique of each of them. And as far as I know, the only thing that we've done in this country is to say, well, one option is to throw it in a hole in the ground, And then we've critiqued that endlessly for 50 years. And so the result of that is that we have a big hole in the ground in Nevada, and we have...
It's going to stay a hole in the ground.
It's going to stay a hole in the ground because nobody's willing to use it.
That's right. Yeah, it's sad really. And I don't know, I mean, it reminds me of these guys who say there's nothing wrong with our climate. You know, they say we don't believe in climate change. We think it's all hokum. It's just some way of, I don't know what. I can't even understand their argument, but they, even though all the evidence is there that we've got a problem, our climate is changing.
I saw an article, somebody had done an analysis of all of the peer-reviewed publications. I don't know how they found them all, but the articles that dealt with climate change. And they found that there were 2,500 or 2,700 articles that appeared over a short period of time. And they looked at the statements that had been made. They found that there were 9,000 some odd authors of those articles, because most articles have a bunch of people writing them. And all of them, they found, out of all of them, 97% said there is human-caused climate change. 3% did not address that question, and 1% said human-caused climate change doesn't exist. And if you looked into the preface of his article, it said it better not exist, because if it does, then the Russian economy is in trouble. And that was his underlying, reaction to that. But 40-some-odd% of the people in the United States believe that it exists, and the rest are unsure or disbelieve it, because they're told by the media that there's a question.
I'm by no means an expert, but there are some scientists on the planet who are very experty in this business, and if they write papers saying all the evidence, you measure the average temperature in the same location year after year after year after year, and you show that it's rising. I mean, I don't see how anybody can deny that. I mean, unless they just don't believe anything. But then what do you do with people like that if they don't believe anything? I mean, you have to really, at some point, you have to accept that peer-reviewed scientific journals have got some
possibility of being right.
Yeah, and to argue against it. But I think it's the same type of thinking, that this denial of reality, it's the same type of thinking that means that people are not, most people in positions of power, they're not willing to worry about nuclear waste. They don't think it's a problem.
I think it's not that so much, Steve, as the idea that they think that it's a problem that they cannot have any effect on. They cannot act in a way that will impinge on the result.
Yeah, but,
and so they don't want to waste their energy on it.
But that's really sad. And but I thought what you were going to say, and maybe what you were going to say, what I thought you were going to say is right, that, because political lifetimes tend to be rather short, and you're talking here a problem that's not really going to be a big problem in the short term. At least that's what we've always said. I think that's changed recently. And I used to be on a committee with George called NEC, New England Coalition, and I used to make the same argument all the time, that one of these days Vermont Yankee is going to close down. And when it closes down, the problem of nuclear waste suddenly becomes a very, very urgent problem for this community. And I mean, it was always an urgent problem having a reactor that, I don't know, in the neighborhood, although it's kind of unlikely, but it can happen that they go wrong, but it can happen. But I think the problem is much bigger now, because there's going to be nobody operating the site.
Well, in fact, it is going to be operated.
That's what they say, but I don't believe that. Well, we'll see what happens.
If energy goes broke, it's going to have to be operated by the state of Vermont.
Somebody's going to have to look after the site.
Somebody has to look after it. There's no question about that. You can't just walk away from something like that. It would be like letting rabid dogs run through the street.
Yeah. What are they talking about doing? Building a different type of energy source on the same site, or? There
is talk about putting a natural gas or more likely a biomass gasification system that could be used alternately with natural gas, and putting that on the site. And it would not be as big, because in terms of its output, because its footprint on the ground, it would be less. It would require more area per unit of power. But at the same time, that's very iffy. There's a lot of question about whether that could happen, and when it could happen, because there's a lot of political, you know, and
as usual,
permits have to be applied for. They have
as
to be
usual.
applied for.
But wouldn't it be nice if something really innovative was done and we built a thorium reactor in Vernon to get rid of the nuclear waste? Get rid of it?
You see, this is the argument that I have. I don't like the idea of nuclear waste in Vernon, and if we could get rid of that waste without putting it on a truck and hauling it across the country, because that's dangerous by itself.
That's dangerous,
if we could get rid of that waste in situ, and at the same time use it as a power generating tool, then we are getting an advantage out of an advantage. We're getting power out of getting rid of the waste. And really, I think it's irresponsible not to look at that as a potential solution to the problem that we've got, because the alternative that we know of is having it hauled out to some place, some hole in the ground. We don't know where. You know, and having it disposed of for a period of time we don't even know how long it is.
Yeah, you're right. That would be a good thing. Just put together a group and do a risk analysis. Which is worse? Which is worse? And concentrate on this community. Forget about the entire planet. Just this. Which is worse? Leaving it there and letting it fall in the river, putting it on a barge and sending it down the river to somewhere.
To Boston.
To Boston. Shipping it by road or rail to somewhere, or building a prototype reactor, and it would have to be a particle accelerator and a reactor, and build it there. Now you might say, well, wouldn't it take 20 years to build a thing from scratch? And the answer is, I don't think so. And in fact, the answer is no. I have a friend who took a position as a professor in a university in South Korea. He's actually, I think he's Swiss, but he's European, and he took a position at some university there because they wanted his expertise to build one of these devices in South Korea. And rather than building it from scratch, what they've decided to do, I haven't talked to him for a year or more, but what he told me they decided to do is, you can buy from Russia a nuclear reactor that normally...
They have a reactor kit that you can buy.
They will sell you a nuclear reactor that normally uses uranium, but it's lead cooled. It has the lead cooling system, which is, you know, not trivial. So you might as well buy one. I mean, the Russians have been working with it for 50 years. Every Russian nuclear reactor in their subs, they're all lead cooled.
I didn't know that.
I know, it's amazing. But so they've got expertise in lead-cooled reactors. And you can buy a cyclotron for about 10 million Swiss francs that will produce this intense beam of neutrons. You have to make protons hit something and then make neutrons to drive the thing. And they're just going to buy thorium, which is cheap. I mean, if anybody of you want to put money into futures, buy thorium futures, because I think the chances of thorium becoming a valuable metal in the next 10, 20 years. They're very, very high. Anyway, so you buy thorium, which is next to nothing. You dig it out of the ground. This country has...
wonderful resources.
Huge. It's in the top 3 of all the countries in the world.
I have read that there's one area in, I think it's Wyoming, where there's about 2 square miles. And we've got enough thorium in those 2 square miles to power for the entire country for a couple of millennia.
Yeah, that's right.
Really?
Yeah, I know. And there's a couple of other countries like that too. I think India's got a big resource.
That's why they're after thorium.
And Australia has too. And curiously, I think Norway has. Norway is one of the big countries. Yeah, Norway was talking about building one of these devices, but then politics got in the way. I mean, you know, they had the Prime Minister of Norway set up a panel to evaluate a thorium reactor, and the panel decided it doesn't have enough economic viability to be worth building.
There was a bid that went out last year for I forget what the bid was for, but there was a small company in Batavia, Illinois, or Geneva, Illinois, somewhere near the border between those two towns.
I know Geneva, Illinois, and you do too, don't you?
Absolutely, I used to live there. But this company was right across the street from the Fabian Park. You know the Fabian Park with the Dutch windmill? They're right across the street from that, and they were hoping to get a bid in to build one of these reactors, and for the military, and the military turned them down because they said that the bid was not believable. And I think the reason is because nobody has tried this before. And it's hard to get somebody to fund trying building one of these things when nobody's built one before. So it's a bootstrapping operation.
That's right, it's a bootstrap. You've got to get all the right people, all supportive at the right time in the right place. It's complicated, but it could be done. We could do it. And if we wanted to redo the simulation, then we'd have to do it quickly. So I think we could devote 6 months to just being absolutely sure. And that would tell us exactly how much thorium we needed. So it's worth doing anyway. But I think if we started tomorrow, we could have that finished by the end of the year. And then buy a Russian nuclear reactor, buy a cyclotron from, I think it's a company in Holland, I think they make them for medical, but I've forgotten the country, but they're not much, maybe 10 million each. And then you just put them all together down in Vernon and get rid of the nuclear waste. What a wonderful thing to try and do. And I bet you could have it all done by the end of 2015 if there was a willingness to do it.
If you could get the Nuclear Regulatory Commission on board as well, because they would have.
Oh yeah, you've got to get
And you'd also have to get the state to permit.
You have to have some powerful people on board.
Right.
So you need money and power, like always.
Right.
But I mean, the stakes are very high, I think. And
the stakes are very high.
Seems to me we should do it.
As a matter of fact, maybe we should repeat what those stakes are. What we are putting up into the pot is about 1,000 tons of nuclear waste we want to get rid of.
Yeah.
That's what we're putting up. That's our down payment on this thing.
That's right.
And then the money that would be required to do it. And if we don't do this, then what we're doing is we're saying, okay, we're just going to have to wait until somebody will find the hole in the ground that stuff is going to get trucked to, and live with the fact that that's going to be dangerous to all humanity for the next 10 million years.
Yeah.
And I think when you look at that and you look at it closely and you think about the consequences of either action or inaction. Okay, action means you have to take the bull by the horns, look at the situation, and do something. Inaction means you're just going to accept the fact that we've got all this nuclear waste and it's not going away.
Yeah.
And so,
unfortunately, human beings are very, very good indeed at only acting after there has been a disaster.
Which is why we have a saying about the closing the barn door after the cows are gone.
After the horses run out, or whatever it is. Yeah,
everybody's left.
But I mean, I don't know. I mean, if we have to wait for a real, true disaster before we act on this, and this is not something that we don't know about. It's a problem we understand. We understand the scale of the problem. We understand the scope. We have at least one solution. I really think that we need a study to come up with
as many solutions as we
possible.
Can get.
Yeah, because every site probably necessitates a different solution. I mean, I would think, and then if we could use Vernon as the test site for the most active solution of all, building a neutron device that gets rid of the waste, actually gets rid of the waste, then I think that would be the best way of using it. But who am I? If anybody out there has any idea how to
get rid of nuclear waste,
well, that's also very important. But if any of you can think of I know exactly how to do it now, and I've got all the people I know. I know very well the team that designed the first energy amplifier, and I know what's wrong with it's not wrong, but it's not complete, their simulation. I'd like to see that redone very quickly.
And there's another thing too, Steve, that I'd like to point out, and that is this is not hokum. This is
not hokum.
It's not hokum. No. It's science.
Yeah.
And it's science that's sufficiently easy to understand that I can understand it and explain it to
It's
people.
not difficult to understand.
Yeah.
And by the way, the guy that really is usually regarded as the inventor of this, even though there have been people who have argued that it was sort of invented earlier in this country and then dropped and then reinvented at CERN. The guy that got the patent is Carlo Rubbia. And Carlo Rubbia has a Nobel Prize in physics.
And was the president.
He is a very eminent particle physicist, nuclear physicist, and now an environmental physicist. He's retired from CERN. He was the Director General of CERN for I don't know how many years, 6 years, I think that's the usual, I can't remember the number of years, but he was director for a full term. He's a very, very eminent scientist, very eminent physicist, very well-known guy, very, very clever guy. He's awe-inspiringly clever, the most clever guy I've ever met. I mean, he knows everything. He's amazing. So it's not, as George said, it's not hokum. It's a device that's been simulated as much as it could be. We need to just check a few things quickly and then build one quickly. If any of you out there are watching this, and maybe everybody's gone to sleep, But if they are there and you've got any idea how we could get a little bit of money and a little bit of power to make this happen, I'm ready to do it. I've retired now, so from my university post, so I'm ready to go. I'll be happy to help anybody if somebody else wants to do it. And I'm pretty cheap. You shouldn't say that. Inexpensive. I'm very inexpensive.
And I could work on this too.
And George, yeah,
I may not be a particle.
And we have an electrical engineer here who could certainly help.
And I may not be an electrical engineer, but I know how to push a broom.
And you know how to write code. You know how to write code.
I know how to write code in Fortran, yes.
I think we probably want to do it with slightly more advanced code. I don't know.
I don't think so. I think we need to do it in code that runs.
You think Fortran's good enough?
I think for this, absolutely.
Well, I've always liked Fortran. It's easier for a physicist to use. C++ is much more difficult.
C++ is a language that I dislike because it is really, really hard to debug. And the reason is because you can have a single function that can have many, many, many little bits of code that are associated with it. And if you're not really careful about how you're going through this, and I know there's somebody out there who's saying, George, you're wrong because we've got better debuggers now. Okay, maybe we do. But you know, you can have several different pieces of code that all have the same name, in effect. And if you know how to do the naming conventions and so forth, you can know which is which, but the amount of code that you've got is magnificently large, and that is not as reliable as magnificently compact.
Yeah, I agree with you. By the way, maybe I could just say one more thing, because we're getting close to the end, I suppose.
We are, I suppose. We've got about 6 minutes.
I mentioned earlier that there was a big conference that was hosted by CERN last year, and people showed up from all over the planet to discuss the future of thorium reactors. And there's no doubt that other countries around the world are sniffing around this technology. They're doing things. I don't quite know what they're doing, but everybody agrees, unless the US gets on board, there will never be any real progress. And I think this country has an amazing track record of solving problems quickly. Big problems quickly.
And so does Scotland.
And I think we need that now. We need the US power behind this problem to solve it quickly.
Well, we need the US power behind a couple of different problems, this being one, and another one being climate change. And the two of them are related, but getting rid of nuclear waste and climate change are two big problems. And you know, you can think of this in terms of building a new reactor that makes power, but I think of it in terms of we need to get rid of climate change and we need to get rid of nuclear waste.
Yeah, I think climate change, it's a bit too late for most people.
For most species.
For many, many, there are going to be nations wiped out completely. Climate change is going to wipe them out in the next 20, 30 years. It's a bit too late. And also, you know, every country is making steps forward again. But
yes.
We have too many people.
But I think we actually are getting to the end of the hour. And Steve, I want to thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
Tom, I want to thank you.
Wait till you get my bill.
Your bill? I'll say, send me a bill for $1 million, and I will send you a check for $1 million.
Thank you.
I guess I'd like to just put in my 2 cents.
Do it.
We have an enormous vacuum being created with the closure of Yankee. And there's a lot of people looking at it and saying, what can we do? And a few ideas are popping up, and we've already just mentioned one where they're talking about gas and biofuel and stuff like that. This could be the solution that the whole world is looking for. It could happen right here in Brattleboro.
Yeah. Well, right there in Vernon.
Right.
Okay, wouldn't that be exciting? Wouldn't that be great if the catalyst was here?
It would mean that the people down in Vernon, of course, it's probably not going to happen, even if it happened as fast as possible.
Yeah.
The people who are down there working at Vermont Yankee. No, that's not really true because they've got to close down. Closing down the plant will take years, but there are people down there who are losing jobs, and it would be nice to be able to have them step into new jobs that would be amenable to them. So I think, yeah. So
you're listening out there.
All
get together.
Yeah.
Get together.
Yes, get together.